guys.
Good morning, Dr. Wall.
Good morning. I'm a little bit behind here. Sorry, I forgot that there were videos and things I had to...
Do you have time for one quick question?
Oh, absolutely.
For lab yesterday, since we didn't have it, will there be any recordings that we need to watch?
No, we went and practiced the recording to make sure it would work. And it worked okay, so I think tomorrow I will go and film during our class time, and then there'll be a video for you on TGMD. Hopefully, that's the plan, if I can get the children to cooperate.
Okay, that sounds good.
I'll put out a announcement once I've got that sorted out for you. I think that older kids, even though I haven't been there for a couple of semesters, the older kids remember me, which is really cute. So I'm hoping that there won't be any issues with getting them to cooperate and let me film them, but you never know. It's been a long time, so we'll see. But that's the plan. We'll see how it goes. Sorry, this is just converting. It's going to take a long time because I forgot to edit it and it's got piles and piles of videos in it. Okay, here we go. Good. All right. Okay, so we're going to start looking at actual motor skills today, and we're going to start with infants and look at some involuntary movements first, and what the brain might be learning from those, and then we'll start looking at those really early movements like sitting up, and we'll work through, over the next couple of chapters, we'll work through locomotor skills, object control skills, timing skills, things like that, all right? So hopefully the next couple of weeks will be really fun movement stuff. Okay. All right, did he turn the camera on? Yeah, good. Okay. All right, so just a reminder, I haven't got an announcement up yet, although I am planning to put one up after class if I have time. Today is National Voter Registration Day. So if you're not registered, jump online, get registered. Okay, so early motor behavior then, when the baby's first born, all right, is involuntary. So we see quite a lot of movements from a young baby, but that baby is not controlling those. They're not deliberate, all right? I mean, they're deliberate from a central nervous perspective, but they're not cognitive, okay? So originally, we used to think, that there wasn't any purpose to these involuntary movements, but the more study that people have done on these spontaneous and reflexive type movements, the more we realize that there are similarities between certain of these skills and certain later skills that we do voluntarily. So there's this relationship, we think, between some of the things we see very early and then some of the motor development that we see later on. All right? So we have two types of movement at this age. The first are called spontaneous movements, and they are not elicited by an external stimulus. They just happen, okay? So something like when you see the baby shake their arms or kick their feet, perhaps, okay? And when we look at those mechanically, so if we put little marker dots on the baby and we film it and we analyze it biomechanically, we see that those arm movements somewhat resemble the reaching movement that we do later on, right? And the kicking looks a little bit like the walking patterns that we see later on, okay? So spontaneous movements are sometimes, in some textbooks and resources, are called stereotypies, okay? And even though they're involuntary, we can see that there's some coordination going on. So the brain is kind of practicing, maybe, these patterns of muscle contraction, okay? The other type are reflexes, and reflexes are very specifically responding to a definite stimulus, all right? So if I produce the stimulus, I will see the reflex, okay? All right, so now I've got to see if I can jump in and out here. I think this is going to take me longer than I planned on the syllabus. Share screen. Application, PowerPoint. Okay. Let's see if this will play for you. Now, can you see the video clip, or can you only see the PowerPoint?
Just the PowerPoint.
Okay, I'm not sure if this is going to work. Let's have another go. Okay. All right, now can you see the video clip?
Yes, we can.
Hurrah! Hurrah! Okay, so this little baby, see how her legs are kicking,
Yes.
right? And there's some wiggling in her arms. Mommy's playing with the ball there. That kicking is not voluntary, all right? So she isn't kicking, her brain is kicking, okay? And all these clips are up on your website book, you know, the web page. And they're also in the PowerPoint slides, so I may not play them all because this is going to take too long, jumping backwards and forwards like this. So we'll never get done. Not quite sure how to tackle that, to be honest. Oh, we already did that bit. Talked about that. Okay, so reflexes are as I said, involuntary. We still have some reflexes as adults, but nowhere near as many as we had as an infant, all right? So the stimulus is presented, and we quickly see the reflex response to that stimulus, okay? And they're usually isolated to a limb or a muscle group. We don't see a reflex that's kind of the whole body reacting. They can't be extinguished. So what that means is that we don't habituate to the stimulus, right? If I keep giving the stimulus over and over again, we don't gradually see a dropping off of the reflex, right? Every time I give the stimulus, we see the reflex to that stimulus, all right? Now, there are expected time spans for these reflexes. There's a table in the chapter that you can take a look at that shows you like, this reflex that starts around this time and finishes around this time. And we'll come back to that idea of finishing in a little while. But they're used quite a lot by pediatricians and clinics and things because they can kind of judge how the brain is developing based upon the reflexes that are being exhibited, okay? If a reflex persists past the typical age range that you would expect to see it, then that would signal that there could be a problem in the central nervous system, and they would do some further checkups on that child, all right? So we can use the reflexes to signify typical development in the baby, but we can also use them to identify something that might be a little bit off that needs checking, okay? So why do we have reflexes, right? Why is this baby born with movements it can't control, okay? So most people feel that they're there to facilitate the baby's survival over time. So if we look at, we'll look at a couple of them in a minute, but you know, like the sucking reflex allows the baby to eat, right? Because it doesn't have voluntary control of its mouth or its throat or the swallowing mechanism yet. So if there wasn't the sucking reflex, then there wouldn't be a way of feeding that baby, okay? So, also, especially if we're coming from constraints approach, an ecological approach, the reflex allows a conversation to occur with the baby's environment, all right? So the mum might stimulate a finger grip, right? And the baby's gripping on to mum's finger, and mum is talking to the baby and looking at the baby, and the baby is looking back at mum, right? So there's this conversation that can occur because the reflexes are occurring. And also, the brain is getting sensory information back from touch receptors, pressure receptors, and things like that from the grasp, okay? And we think that possibly some of them certainly appear to provide a foundation for future movement skills that we see voluntarily as the child gets older. All right, I'm not going to play this one for you. I'll show you what happens here. So asymmetrical tonic neck reflex is one of the more primitive reflexes that we see. And here what happens is you lay the baby on its back and you turn the stimulus to the central nervous system is turning the head to one side or the other, okay? So what happens there is when you turn the head that way, the arm and the leg on that side stretch out, right? So baby's lying on its back, you turn its head, arm and leg stretch out. Well, if you look at that movement, right, if you put the baby down on a surface that isn't level and its head turned, then there will be a good chance of it rolling over and it might end up smothering, right? So when the head turns and the arm and the leg come out, now it can't roll over, right? So there's this protective feature kind of built in to the reflex. Right, so palmar grasp is one everybody would recognize, right? You touch the baby's hand and it wraps its fingers around your finger, or and you know, if you bend over and you've got a necklace on and the necklace or your hair touches the baby's finger, they grasp hold of it, right? And we all think that's really cute. Oh, they're hanging on to us, they're hugging us, or, right, they're not, because they're not in control of it, okay? And the interesting thing is the brain can close the fingers at this point, it can't open them again. So once it's grasped your finger, the only way to get your finger out is to kind of open the hand back up and get your finger out, okay? And we're not going to go through every single reflex that's in the list, but we'll do a couple of them. Symmetrical tonic neck reflex, if they're sitting up and you move the head backwards, right, then the arms extend and the legs flex up. If you move the head forwards, the arms flex up and the legs extend, right? So it's kind of trying to stop you from tipping backwards or forwards. Now, we'll leave Moreau. You can have a look at that one. Okay, labyrinthine writing reflex is quite interesting because this is one of the ones that look as though the brain is working on postural control, all right? So it's fascinating to watch. If you hold the baby upright and you tilt it, humans like to be upright and straight, right? That's kind of our instinct. And so what happens when you tilt the baby to one side, the head tries to stay upright for as long as it can, right? So there's a picture on this next slide to show you what that looks like. Right? So you can see the head is trying to remain upright even though the body is being tilted to one side. Okay, now the stepping reflex is a really interesting one from a research point of view, right? So to initiate a stepping reflex, you hold the baby up and allow the bottom of the feet to touch either the floor or a table or whatever. And then what you see is the baby lifts its feet up. So it kind of elicits this pattern that looks a bit like walking, okay? So this is a really fascinating piece of research that supported, let's go back here, that supports our idea of the constraints triangle, all right, our constraints theory. Because what was found is that the stepping reflex disappears around 6 months, okay? And so we used to think that these reflexes were there for a period of time, then they disappear, and then several months later we see a voluntary pattern that mimics the reflex. But what was found in what's called the bathtub research, they were playing with this baby and a stepping reflex, and they had the baby come back. So people who study infants tend to study them across the whole year, and so they would have the baby come back at regular intervals and they would check the reflexes again. So what they found was around 6 months or so, I think it's 6 months, the stepping reflex doesn't happen, right? You give the stimulus, nothing happens. Well, think about what is happening to that baby across the first 6 months, right? So when it's born, it doesn't have a lot of adipose tissue, but by 6 months, during that first 6 months, that baby is piling on weight, fat tissue, some muscle tissue. It's growing, so its bones are getting heavier, right? So they tried taking the same baby that does not reflex step on the floor, and they put the baby into a big tub of water and put the feet on the bottom of the tub. And in the water, they got a stepping reflex, right? Because the water was supporting the weight of the baby and the legs. Okay, that's why we use water therapy for athletes who are injured. We use water therapy for greyhounds and racehorses who are injured, because it allows them to do some movement without all that weight on the injury. Right? Does that make sense? So what that shows us then is that the reflex did not go away, but the change in structural constraints of the baby meant that that movement pattern couldn't emerge without changing the environment. Which I think is pretty cool, right? It's a pretty fascinating way to consider the constraints theory idea, all right? And it meant that for the first time, we had information that suggested that not all these reflexes go away, they just kind of get subsumed by changes in the structure and then voluntary movement that begins relatively quickly after that. Right? So table 4.1, all right? Have a look at those reflexes. Let me see if I can find what page that is for you. That is page 50. right? So some of these reactions we still have, like a parachute reaction, if you look at that one, you still see parachute reflexes in adults, right? So if you trip and you're falling, what's the first thing you do?
Step forward.
Let's say you've gone too far to step.
Put your arms out.
Put your arms out, right? Parachute reflex, okay? It's one of the things that causes quite a lot of problems in elderly populations because they trip and fall and put their hand out and then they break their wrists or their elbow or their shoulder. They're really unlucky, right? We never get over parachute reflex. It doesn't get subsumed and disappear. It's just that most of the time we're on balance and we don't trip very often, and so we don't see it in adults, right? Not that it's gone. Okay, so during this reflex period then, we've already talked about some of the structural constraints that change quite dramatically, okay? We're also getting a lot of functional change, so the baby is becoming more cognizant of its surroundings. It's becoming more inquisitive, right? So as we transition out of reflexes and into voluntary movement, we start to see a lot of movement patterns that are the baby trying to learn something about an object or something it can see, right? So, in later infancy, so we're looking at kind of 6, 7, 8 months onwards, we start to see voluntary control of movements. And the baby's sight has improved quite a lot when they're first born. They don't see very well at all. It's kind of like looking through a glass where there's rain pouring down all the time, right? So everything's a bit fuzzy for them. And they can't distinguish depth or things like that, so they kind of recognize mum because she smells like mum and sounds like mum, rather than because she looks like mum, right? And they're starting to have, you know, these meaningful interactions. They know who's mum, who's dad, right? Hopefully they have books and toys that you've been playing with, and so they're getting these interactions, and we've been getting these postural reflexes that kind of start to become postural voluntary movements. So our postural reactions, like that labyrinthine writing reaction, they start around 4 months, and they help the baby to maintain its position within its environment. So they start off as reflexes, and then they get incorporated into this voluntary group of movements that we see. Right? So we mentioned parachute already. You can have a look at derotative writing. I think they might have a film clip of that one. Okay. Let's see. We've done bathtub. right. So, we come to movements that are still not well controlled, right? But they're starting to be voluntary now, right? And we've already talked a little bit in lab about the fact that these fundamental motor skills are the building blocks, they're the foundation for later motor skills to come, right? And they're cumulative and they're sequential. So we have an order that we expect to see motor skills appear. Okay. So one of the things I want to show you here, I'm not quite sure how to do this. Now you know what, I'm not going to show you this. That's going to take too long on this setup. So I have a couple of models here. I talked to you a little bit about the first one with the proficiency barrier in it when we were looking at motor skills earlier in the semester. So I am going to put PDFs of these two models up for you to take a look at. One of them is this kind of pyramid idea that has the top cut off, and it's got reflexes and early movements like sitting up, pulling to stand, and then fundamental motor skills like walking, running, throwing, and then the proficiency barrier. And we talked about this already, that we have to cross that proficiency barrier to learn more skills, right? So if I'm not competent in those fundamental motor skills, if I'm not at the end of the right-hand side, at the end of the continuum on my MSU chart, and I'm not scoring well on the TGMD, then it's going to be very, very difficult to progress and learn further movement skills for lifetime activities or for PE or for specific sports skills, okay? So we've got that model, and then the other model is called the hourglass, and it's quite a well-known model. You'll see this a lot in resources, and they're just trying to use the hourglass to explain that as you put more sand in, and the sand represents experience, so the individual passes through these levels of movement skills. All right? So I will put both of those up for you. To go to Lubbock after class, so if I don't get them up today, yell at me tomorrow and remind me to put them up. Alright? Where are we here? Alright, so our motor milestones, be a little bit careful with the book. I prefer the term rudimentary motor skills here, because we use the term fundamental motor skills for throwing, catching, hopping, leaping, skipping, batting, right? And so I think that can get a little bit confusing. Let me find a table for you for that one. Is on motor milestones, here we go, is on page 56. So in motor milestones we have things like being able to lift their head up, right? Being able to roll over, being able to sit unassisted without falling backwards. When you look at that table, the original research that was done that produced that table is pretty old, right? Back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. So what we see with infants today doesn't mean that that research is wrong, right? They still attain these motor milestones at roughly the same time that they did back then. Even though we've got better nutrition now, we have more inclusive toys, right? So we still see that what am I trying to say here? That the central nervous system hasn't started to develop more quickly, even though we're providing it more nutrition. But the timeline for these motor milestones, for this baby to be able to sit up, for the baby to be able to pull itself up standing, is the same now, right? What have I got? No, I'd rather show you that one. Okay. All right. So, how do these milestones go? All right. So, at 2 months, the baby can lift its head up in a prone position. That means from lying on its stomach. All right. Cannot lift its head up if you lie on its back. Okay. By about 3 months, it's able to get its shoulders up a little bit, which means it can start to turn its head and look around the room. Okay. So this is pretty crucial in the development of this child. Not just its physical and motor development, but in its cognitive development, because now it can look around and see things. Okay? So think about what constraints, if we go back to our triangle, what's going on here? Why at 8 weeks, 9 weeks old, can this baby lift its head up if it's lying on its tummy, but it can't lift its head up lying on its back? What do you think? Jean? Have a go. Give me an idea. No? Kayla, what do you think? Why can it lift its head up when it's lying on its tummy, but not when it's lying on its back?
Is it because they would be pushing off of their arms versus when they were sitting up?
Okay, a little bit, right? It's stronger when it's lying on its tummy. Think about the size of the head of this baby, right, in relation to its body. Think about the musculature in the back of your neck and your arms and your shoulders versus the musculature in the front of your neck, right? So we get lifting our head up on our tummy because we've got stronger muscles to lift the head up that way, and we don't have those yet to lift the head up lying on its back. Okay? The other thing to take away from this idea is that it's really, really, really important that babies get tummy time, right? That we don't leave the baby lying on its back all the time, because all it can do when it lies on its back is stare at the ceiling, right? It's not going to be learning very much by staring at the ceiling. So if we don't give them tummy time, then we get some cognitive delays and perceptual delays because they're lying there staring at the ceiling. All right? Okay, this one I want to show you. So let's see, can I do this from here? No, because I have to open it up. I want to show you this one. Oops, no. Then I need to go here, and I need to share. Okay. All right. So, this baby is a bit older, and it's rolling over now. Okay, so that baby is probably around 5 months old. Okay, look at those chubby knees. They're so cute. They're so cute at this age. Right? So around 5 months, if you watch what's going on here, now it can roll itself over from its back, so it's much, much stronger in around the front of its neck, right? Also, you can see that the head is a little more proportional to the rest of the body, right? At 5 months, they're also able to sit unassisted. Now, you want to make sure that they have cushions behind them, because they do still occasionally roll over. But yeah, they can sit up on their own. Where did we get to? Past that, there we go. Okay. Once it can roll over, and it's getting more control, we start to see some interesting attempts at self-locomotion. Okay, so we get, by about 7 months, the baby can roll over and lift itself up onto its hands and knees. And then it's stuck, right? It gets to its hands and knees, and we start to see this kind of rocking motion, right? And it's sort of just stuck there. It can't do anything once it gets there, okay? Think about what the brain has to do now, okay? The left side of my brain controls my right arm and my right leg. The right side of my brain controls my left arm and my left leg, right? So now what do? Right? Well, first off, my shoulders have to get strong enough that when I lift one hand up, I don't face plant. Okay? So the rocking motion is almost like a training program for the front of the shoulders. Okay? And my brain has to work out how to lift something off the floor. Okay? That involves shifting my center of gravity. Right? I have to shift my weight onto the other 3 limbs. Okay? If I'm going to pick my hand up and I don't want to face plant, I've got to be balanced on a smaller surface area. Right? Think about what we did in chapter 3. Okay? So it takes about 4 to 5 weeks for the brain to work this out. And then for most babies, not all babies, but for most babies, we start to see creeping on their hands and knees. All right? So then life is wrecked for mum and dad, because as of 8 months, they're not where you put them when you walked away. Right? Up until 8 months, it's great. You can put them down, you can walk away, you can make yourself a coffee, you can come back, they're still there, right? Once they start creeping, life is done, right? So around 8 months, that's an average. Could be a little bit earlier, could be a little bit later, right? But on average, it's going to be 8 months. And not all babies creep, right? Most creep, but some choose a different way to self-locomote. And again, that's a very interesting example of our constraints triangle. Because imagine if you grow up in a house that has all tile floor, right? So you grow up somewhere warm because the floors are tiled instead of carpeted, all right? Well, hands and knees is going to be pretty uncomfortable on a tiled floor, right? So some babies, instead of creeping, do what we call bum scoot, right? So they learn to sit on their bottoms and pull themselves along by their heels because their nappy slides along the floor if they're living in a house that has smooth floors rather than carpets, right? Bum creeping doesn't work, bum scooting rather, doesn't work on carpet, right? So babies that grow up in a house that has carpet don't bum scoot, okay? So it's a really interesting concept, and it very dramatically illustrates what happens when I change the environment, how that interacts to change the movement pattern that we see observed, right? Questions? Done that, we've done that, we've done that. Ooh, we're close. All right. One more, and then we will okay. So 8 months, we start to see self-locomotion of one type or another. Okay. About 4 weeks later, this baby has been pottering around the house, right? Getting into things it shouldn't be getting into, being very inquisitive, because one of the biggest traits of the human race is that we're hugely inquisitive, right? So they're going around all over the place, looking at things and investigating stuff, right? But just imagine looking at your whole world from the level of your knees, okay? So over that 4 weeks, they're like, I know there's something up there, right? I know there's something else up there, but I can't get to it from hands and knees. So by about 9 months, they are cognitively developed enough to understand they want to look further, and they're strong enough to start pulling themselves up to stand, right? And then, again, depending upon the environment that the baby is in, you might see it start to cruise along the furniture. So if you have a big, long couch, right, it'll pull itself up to stand at one end, and then it can, you know, move along. As long as it's got its hands on the couch, it can move all the way along to the other end. Okay? Now, if you have a big, spacious lounge and the furniture is very spread out, can't cruise very far, I have to drop back down to my hands and knees and creep over to the next piece of furniture. Right? So let's see what this standing up pattern looks like. Go back to the beginning, people. All right, so probably mum, could be the researcher, but it's probably mum playing with the toy. Here we go. I want to see this toy. Oh, I don't know what to do with that leg. There we go. Right? That leg's getting a bit roguey there. Right? So it's not exactly stable. Here we go. Whee! All right. So one of the interesting things to watch when they get to this stage and they're starting to pull themselves up is how the brain learns to control all these bits of this body, right? So your hip joints are a ball and socket joint. They're very, very mobile. So the baby tries to stand up and the hips are going all over the place, right? And the brain's got to go, whoa, how the heck do I control the hip joint? Right? Which muscles do I have to turn on to control the hip joint? Right? Because until I can control the hip joint, I can't let go of the surface. Right? So you could see that baby, like the one leg was all over the place, and the ankles were wobbling, and the knees were going, and right? There are all these what we call degrees of freedom that have to be controlled in order to stand, right? And we do it automatically as adults, we don't even think about it, right? But when you watch, one of the fascinating things, although I don't do infant research, but one of the fascinating things is to watch. You can almost see the brain learning every minute, right? What do I do here, right? The brain has to turn on the muscles in order to keep the hip joints stable. And until that happens, I can't stand unassisted, I can't walk, I can't do anything else. Right? I have to keep resorting back to whichever locomotion pattern I picked up when I was younger. Okay? Question. Questions?
I don't think so.
Okay. So I would strongly recommend that you take a little bit of time to get into the textbook website and pull up chapter 4 so that you can watch some of these videos and see these ideas for yourself, right? Because reading them and seeing them are different, right? Seeing them makes that reading meaningful. Otherwise it's just reading, right? And they've got lots of different videos up there that you can take a look at. Okay? And then on Thursday, we'll finish the last couple of slides for chapter 4 and we'll start chapter 5. Okay? So, lab tomorrow, We won't be in the Collaborate classroom. Ryan and I will be on the playground. We'll get some film. I will load the film up and I'll let you know. I'll email you and tell you that there's film there for you to look at. Okay? All right. That sounds okay?
Yes.
I will probably be calling on you, Kayla, next week sometime for a meeting, so that you can give me some ideas about whether or not the video is working.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay, have a good afternoon. Be safe, have fun, enjoy the weather, beautiful fall weather that we're having.